Welcome back, everybody, to week 3 of this Intro to Digitization Projects course. This week, we're going to be talking about obtaining permission for your digital stewardship digital projects. So here's what we're going to cover this week. Permissions versus copyright, which can be two different things. Kind of a little bit of copyright 101, some information about fair use, the idea of putting your materials online for the public to see versus just having a digital copy on site at your library or historical society, and then some takedown policies and procedures. And this week's lecture is relatively long, so I've split it up into 2 recordings. So first off, let's talk about permissions versus copyright. This is a super important foundational concept. There are intellectual property rights granted by copyright laws and regulations, which we're going to go through some of those in just a moment. But just because the law says you can digitize and share something doesn't always mean you should. A key example here is materials depicting culturally sensitive content, such as Indigenous people or ceremonies, which we'll also talk about more in a moment, but just to lay the foundation here. You may be well within your legal rights to digitize and share such images, but is that really in the best interest of the people depicted and your organization? So thinking back to last week's topic, why are you digitizing? Does digitizing materials that are culturally sensitive serve the why, your purpose for this project? I'm also going to say here that I take the stance that when we are doing digitization projects, we should err on the side of what the least powerful party would like to do. So the institutions that many of us work for have lots of societal power. The historical societies, libraries, and archives we work for. And just by the fact that we're doing digitization projects means we probably have the resources and therefore the power in this equation. So the most ethical thing to do, and that which frankly will help you avoid the most potential problems later, is to operate in the best interest of the person or the group with the least amount of power. So let's get into a little bit of what that means. Let's talk first about copyright kind of 101 and lay the foundation here for what copyright looks like. And here's a very important disclaimer through the entire course, but especially this particular week's content. I am not a lawyer, and this is the barest introduction to copyright information as it pertains to digital projects. So please know that you'll have to do much more in-depth research on copyright and permissions questions than what we're talking about here in this lecture. And as with every unit in the course, you're getting just enough information to know what questions to ask in the future. So first off, number 1, owning a physical item is not the same thing as owning the copyright for that item. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in just a second. Number 2, not everything in your collections is going to be covered by copyright. And in fact, more materials may be out of copyright than you might expect. And we're going to talk today about some steps for how to figure that out. And number 3, understanding these copyright basics is not only important for you as the representative of, your organization, archive, local historical society, or museum. Understanding the copyright is also really important for your community members because knowing the copyright status of an item helps users determine what they can and cannot do with your content. Can they make their own copy? Can they add elements to that copy? As your organization determines the copyright status of the items in your collection, it's important to share that information with your audiences so that they can use the content responsibly. So you might be asking, who owns the copyright then to these materials? And this is going back to what I said about owning the thing is not the same thing as having the copyright. So typically, the copyright belongs to the creator of the work, the author, the photographer, the artist. And then there are times when people produce things as part of their job, and that's considered something called work for hire. And in those situations, the copyright belongs to the employer. A good example might be a campus photographer where the copyright photos belong to the college or university that hired the photographer. So a big thing to remember here is the ownership of the copyright stays with the copyright holder until the copyright expires or is legally transferred. So just because a person owns a thing does not mean they own or can transfer the underlying copyright in that thing. So for instance, here's an example. Say a donor has gifted you with a Picasso painting. Unless the donor has a written transfer of copyright from the Picasso estate, the donor doesn't have any copyrights that they can transfer to you. They can only transfer the ownership of the physical painting. Relatedly, keep in mind that scanning or digitizing an item does not create a new copyright. So if the donor gives you the Picasso painting and your organization makes a digital copy of that painting, let's say really good photography, you don't now get to say that your organization has the rights to the digital copy. That digital copy has the same copyright status as the original item. So we said that the copyright in most cases is held by the original creator. But there are many, many cases where no one owns the copyright because the copyright term has been expired, perhaps the item wasn't copyrightable in the first place, or it never was copyrighted in the first place. Essentially, anything not covered by copyright is considered to be in the public domain. Works in the public domain can be used by anyone without getting permission and without attributing the source. So that means that if you have materials, you're digitizing materials that you can identify as in the public domain, you shouldn't be concerned about copyright risk. It also means, though, that once you put public domain items online, users don't have to ask for your permission or attribute the content to your institution. It's considered to be a good practice to attribute the source of public domain materials, but just be aware that it is not absolutely required. To figure out whether an item is in the public domain or not, you'll need to know whether the item was considered published or unpublished, and if possible, the date that it was created. There are some specifics in the Digital Readiness Toolkits section for this week about dates and how the dates differ for published and unpublished works, as well as definitions of what published and unpublished means. But here's a tool that is super useful. I highly recommend checking out the Copyright Status tool from UW-Madison. It's linked in your readings and in the syllabus to help with these questions. Of course, there's another disclaimer here that it also is not legal advice, but it's a great step-by-step tool that will help at least give you information about how to make an informed decision about the copyright status of items. So let's circle back now to the issue of fair use. Fair use is a provision in US copyright law that allows for the use of copyrighted content, not content that's in the public domain. But if something has a copyright and you still want to use it, there is a provision in US copyright law that allows for the use of copyrighted content for specific purposes like education and research. Sometimes organizations make the assumption that since research or education are part of my organizational mission, anything we do counts as fair use, but it's actually a lot fuzzier than that. It's more of a spectrum or a scale. There are various factors, they're called the 4 factors, that tip the balance towards or away from fair use of in-copyrighted materials. The 4 factors are purpose, nature, amount, and effect. And there's information in your readings from Columbia University Libraries about what each of those 4 factors are. So, for instance, if you're making full versions of in-copyright materials available online for commercial purposes like selling reproductions, that tilts the balance very far away from fair use. Anybody looking at that use of copyrighted materials would say that's not educational or nonprofit or research use. And by contrast, if you're making a copy or a little small part of a copyrighted item available online for educational purposes only, and you're not making any money off of it, that tilts the balance towards a fair use assessment. So a handy tool to help you think through this is the Fair Use Checklist from Columbia Universities. Again, make sure you read their information on the 4 factors first, but this too is listed in your syllabus and the readings for this week's assignment. We're going to pause there and go to the next recording.